I stood outside the gated entrance, shouting into the intercom, my eyes fixed on the paramedics desperately trying to break the keypad. My father was only a few dozen feet away, dying, and yet the gate refused to open. On the other side, the community president, Ms. Parker, stood with her arms crossed, unbothered by the emergency unfolding before her. Without hesitation, she coldly muttered, "Rules are rules." 3 days later, my father passed away. 3 months after that, the lawsuits came flooding in like an unrelenting storm. Guess who lost everything? Yep, me. This is the story of how Ms. Parker's rigid adherence to policy cost my father his life, and how I dismantled her entire authority, one fine letter at a time. It all started on a Tuesday, which felt ominous right from the get-go. I had already spent hours on the phone with the DMV, dealing with a mind-numbing issue when my phone rang. It was my dad, sounding off, which was strange. He was a tough ex-Marine who would never complain about anything, but today was different. His voice was slurred, his words disjointed. He said his right side was numb, his vision was blurry, and I didn't hesitate. I dialed 911 and rushed out of my office. My dad lived in a gated neighborhood, run by an HOA that considered itself a fortress. They had a rule book for every little thing, from acceptable noise levels to when you could walk your dog. But the most ridiculous rule was their strict control over who could access the community and when. By the time I reached the gate, the paramedics were already there. Their ambulance sat idle, sirens silent but lights flashing, as they furiously pounded the keypad, hoping for a miracle that never came. I sprinted up to them, panic coursing through me. My dad was in there alone, and every second counted. I pressed the intercom button, the speaker crackled to life, and Ms. Parker's smug face appeared on the screen. She looked like someone who had watched too many spy movies, with her perfectly pressed blouse and hair so stiff it might as well have been a helmet. She looked at the situation, then at me, and said, "This vehicle is not registered. Please follow the proper procedures, emergency or not." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I shouted through the intercom that my father was having a stroke, that we needed help immediately, but all she did was look down at her clipboard. Her response? "Residents are responsible for pre-approving all visitors, including emergency vehicles." Then she hung up on me. The gate remained locked. It took another 13 minutes of furious waiting before a sympathetic board member finally manually opened it. The paramedics rushed my father to the hospital, but it was too late. His stroke had already progressed too far. He never regained consciousness, passing away 2 days later. I signed the papers to turn off his life support, but the tears didn't come. Not yet. At the funeral, Ms. Parker sent a wreath. But there was something hidden inside it, an official violation notice. Apparently, our lawn had grown half an inch too long while I was in the hospital with my dying father. That's when I snapped. It was like a switch flipped inside me. I stopped grieving and started plotting. These HOA people weren't just annoyances. They were bullies with too much power. Ms. Parker thought she was untouchable, but I was going to prove her wrong. I dove deep into their rules and regulations, scouring every clause in their charter, every detail in the community bylaws. And guess what? The gate was illegal. It lacked proper emergency override mechanisms and didn't meet local safety codes. Every minute it stayed locked during an emergency was a liability. But I needed more to take action. I started talking to neighbors, casually at first, just making small talk while walking my dad's dog. The things I learned were astonishing. One neighbor's dog had perished in a fire because the fire truck couldn't get through. Another woman had been denied an Uber to the hospital because she wasn't on the guest list. And Ms. Parker? She was fining people for parking violations that were as petty as they were infuriating. I wasn't just angry, I was gathering evidence. But then, Ms. Parker tried to get the upper hand. She sent me a certified letter, accusing me of disrupting the community's peace by yelling at the paramedics. That's right. She cited me for begging for emergency help to save my father's life. I had to read the letter a few times, not because it was confusing, but because it was so absurd. This wasn't just incompetence, it was dangerous. And now I had the documentation to prove it. I filed my first complaint with the city, a request for a public review of their gate installation. No surprise, It was installed illegally. Then came a fire marshal's report, followed by a complaint about accessibility. I didn't go for one big strike. Instead, I delivered 1,000 small, calculated blows. But just when I thought I was getting into a rhythm, I had a visitor. A man in a suit showed up at my door, sunglasses on even though it was indoors. "You've been served," he said, handing me a folder. Ms. Parker had filed a lawsuit against me for harassment, defamation, and emotional disruption. And here's the kicker. She had filed it under the HOA's name, which meant the whole board was now entangled in the mess. Standing there on my porch, holding that folder, I realized something remarkable. Ms. Parker had just made her biggest mistake. She had made it personal, and that was exactly what I needed. The lawsuit was weak, full of vague accusations and HOA jargon, but it lacked any mention of the fact that her gate had cost my father his life. She was more concerned about her precious rules than the people in her community. And that's when I knew it was time to go in for the kill. So I did what any reasonable adult with a grudge and a caffeine addiction would do. I hired a lawyer. My attorney, Denise, was sharp, calm, and had handled more HOA cases than she could remember. When I handed her the lawsuit, she burst out laughing so hard she had to take a sip of water to calm down. "Oh, she's in for it," Denise said, flipping through the pages like they were nothing more than junk mail. We filed a motion to dismiss, but we didn't stop there. Denise filed a counterclaim: wrongful death, negligence, obstruction, emotional distress. And the cherry on top, a public accountability lawsuit that would drag both Karen and the entire HOA into the spotlight. The moment that case went public, everything shifted. A local news station picked up the story. HOA blocks emergency access. Resident dies. The anchor even mentioned my father's name. That's when people started reaching out. Strangers, former HOA board members from other communities, even a retired firefighter who had faced the same gate delays in a different development. Everyone had a story, and more importantly, everyone hated their HOA. I went from a grieving son to an unlikely hero in this small corner of suburban warfare. I never asked for it, but now I was going to use it. Karen didn't handle the attention well. Her public statement was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive nonsense. "While our community mourns the unfortunate loss," she said, "we must also remember the importance of order, security, and respect for the procedures that are designed to protect us all." It was as if she were saying my father's death was just an inconvenient scheduling error. Her smugness only made things worse. The comments section of the news article exploded. People were furious, not just about the HOA blocking medical aid, but sharing their own stories. One person talked about the gate being locked during a fire. Another recalled paramedics being delayed in a heart attack emergency. Families were fined for hosting birthday parties with guests who weren't registered. Karen had unknowingly opened Pandora's box. Within 2 weeks, the HOA was under heavy scrutiny. The city started investigating the gate system. A fire marshal showed up unannounced and found that the emergency override had been out of order for over a year. Strike one. Then, the ADA compliance team showed up and found multiple violations for elderly and disabled residents who couldn't access their homes. Strike two. But the real bombshell came next: the insurance audit. It turned out their liability insurance had lapsed 6 months earlier because Karen had ignored the renewal invoice. Strike three. The HOA wasn't just in trouble. It was bleeding out, and Karen still walked around like she was untouchable. She continued issuing citations, calling board meetings as if she hadn't already reached the edge of a legal cliff. At one of these meetings, she actually accused me of running a coordinated smear campaign against her leadership, as if I had the time or energy to stage a political revolt against the queen of the cul-de-sac. I recorded everything, every word, every absurd interaction, every ridiculous piece of paper shoved under my door. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. In the HOA world, documentation is ammunition. Meanwhile, Denise worked overtime. She demanded financial records from the HOA. When they delayed, she filed a subpoena. What we found in those records was enlightening. Karen had been reimbursing herself for community representation expenses, thousands of dollars for spa treatments, fancy dinners, boutique hotel stays, all charged under vague descriptions like external relations or professional morale boosting. In other words, she was stealing. We handed everything over to the city attorney's office, and finally, the wheels of justice began to turn. But the moment that made it real, the day I'll never forget, was when I walked past Karen's house and saw a city inspector stapling a bright red violation notice to her front door. It wasn't just poetic, it was cinematic. The woman who had fined me for grass growing half an inch too long now had a citation for an unpermitted water feature and misreported landscaping expenses. Apparently, the koi pond she installed last spring had been built without a permit. You can't make this stuff up. Yet, Karen didn't back down. As board members started resigning, she held a press conference on the community lawn. I kid you not, she stood in front of a homemade banner that read "Leadership Under Fire," claiming she was being targeted because she was a strong woman who enforced order in a chaotic world. Half the residents laughed, the other half groaned. No one cheered. It was over, but she still didn't know it. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from a woman named Linda. Her voice was soft, nervous. She claimed to have been on the HOA board until last year and wanted to meet. I agreed, and we sat down at a local coffee shop. Linda told me the real story. Karen had been threatening board members with lawsuits if they didn't follow her decisions. She had allegedly forged signatures on internal votes. And worst of all, there had been previous emergency gate failures that were covered up by editing the entry logs. Linda handed me a flash drive and said she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. I took it home, plugged it in, and saw everything: emails, meeting transcripts, internal memos, proof of deliberate negligence, cover-ups, and manipulation of the HOA's own systems. I now had confirmation that my father wasn't the first person affected by Karen's actions, just the last. That changed everything. This wasn't just a civil case anymore. This was criminal negligence. I sat there, flipping through documents, and realized what had to come next. The lawsuit was just the beginning. The real war was about to start. And Karen? She was going to regret not opening that damn gate. Karen didn't see it coming. She was too busy giving interviews to local lifestyle blogs and sending out defensive HOA newsletters, calling herself a victim of online mobs and misinformation. She pretended everything was fine as her fragile empire crumbled. But when subpoenas started landing in people's mailboxes like flaming arrows, things got quiet. Real quiet. 3 board members quit in the same week. One of them left a resignation letter taped to the clubhouse door that simply read, "I didn't sign up for this." No signature. Just that line. The tone had changed. Panic had set in. The city attorney didn't waste any time. They began cross-referencing the files from the flash drive with official reports. The discrepancies were so glaring, it was almost laughable. The gate entry logs had been scrubbed clean on multiple occasions. Entire days were missing. Days when residents had complained about ambulance delays or service workers being denied entry. One log even showed a man's oxygen tank delivery being turned away because the driver wasn't pre-approved. That man had to be hospitalized. And Karen? She still hadn't figured out she was already losing. That night, Karen buried it all, just like she buried everything that didn't fit her perfect, peaceful community narrative. Denise amended our lawsuit to include charges of criminal negligence and fraud. Karen was now being sued personally, not just in her role as HOA president. That's when things started to get real. Her house, her car, her accounts, they were all suddenly within reach. Her lawyer, some second-rate attorney who looked like he did business out of a mall kiosk, was the least of her worries. I almost felt sorry for him, until I remembered who he was defending. Someone who had weaponized the gate to delay medical care and let a man die. Karen's composure cracked in stages. First, she stopped attending board meetings. Then, she started sending out memos from a private email address, which we immediately subpoenaed. When her own neighbors began testifying against her, Karen snapped. She went full scorched earth, accusing everyone of conspiring against her, of being brainwashed by the internet, and, my favorite accusation, being anti-community. Whatever that meant. Meanwhile, Denise and I just kept stacking up evidence. More statements, more affidavits, more expert witnesses. One even came forward, a former emergency responder who had flagged this exact HOA for dangerous delays years ago, and had been ignored. That phrase became our rallying cry, politely ignored. Karen did it best, until people stopped being polite. The deposition came, and Karen was a shadow of her former self. No clipboard, no pearls, just a nervous, defensive posture. She kept looking at her lawyer like he was going to leap across the table to save her every time she was cornered. But Denise never raised her voice. She calmly dismantled Karen, question by question, email by email. Karen tried to dodge, blame others, or claim she didn't remember certain conversations, but the flash drive didn't lie. There was an entire thread where Karen explicitly discussed delaying emergency services to protect the HOA from future liabilities. Imagine thinking letting someone die was the best way to protect your organization. After the deposition, the city revoked the HOA's operational license. That doesn't happen often, but the city had seen enough. The HOA was so tangled in corruption, mismanagement, and cruelty that they decided to place the entire community under municipal management. Overnight, Karen lost everything. Her authority? Gone. The gate she loved to defend? Dismantled. Her parking violation crusade? Canceled. And the icing on the cake? The new city-appointed manager was the same person Karen had once fined for leaving his trash cans out too long. The irony was so thick you could taste it. Of course, the legal fallout didn't end there. The civil case gained so much momentum that Karen was starting to sweat. Multiple plaintiffs joined the case. Families, elderly residents, people she had fined, threatened, or ignored. The case file looked like a phone book by the time we were done. Karen tried to settle quietly, but Denise wasn't having it. We weren't going to let this end in a sealed deal with a slap on the wrist. People had suffered, some permanently. My dad had died. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability, and for the first time in Karen's miserable reign, she couldn't escape it. At one point, Karen tried to sell her house to avoid the court-ordered lien. But as soon as the listing went live, the comments section lit up like a Christmas tree. Is this the house where that HOA psycho lived? Does the gate still murder people? Or is that extra? The real estate agent quit after 4 days. Public opinion had turned her into a pariah. She wasn't just Karen anymore. She was that Karen. The cautionary tale. The meme. The story people told at barbecues to warn others about the dangers of unchecked HOA power. The trial date was set for late spring, but Karen's side blinked first. Her lawyer proposed a settlement. Massive damages, full admission of fault, and a public apology. Denise wanted to push for more, but I knew what I wanted. Not just money, not just her house. I wanted something permanent. So, I negotiated one last condition. Karen would be legally banned from holding any position in any HOA or property management group for the rest of her life. Lifetime disqualification. She could plant flowers in her own yard, but she would never again hold a clipboard. When the judge read the terms aloud, Karen looked like someone had just stolen her spine. She nodded, barely, like a child forced to apologize in front of the class. When it was all over, I walked past her without a word. I didn't need to say anything. She knew. Afterward, I went home and checked the mailbox. Inside was one final letter from the dissolved HOA. It was an old one, delayed in delivery, postmarked before everything had gone down. It was another citation, this time for excessive wind chimes. I laughed out loud. It was so perfectly ridiculous, so on brand for her reign of petty tyranny, that I framed it. But just when I thought the story was over, I got another call from Linda. Her voice was different this time, urgent. She said she had something else, something bigger, a second flash drive, one Karen had hidden. This one had information not just about our community, but several others Karen had been involved with over the years. Patterns, deals, secret finds, and potentially even more deaths. That's when I realized it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Karen might have lost her gate, her title, her money, but what she built, the machine of quiet abuse disguised as community order, might still be alive in other places. And if it was, I had a new mission. Because I wasn't just going to burn the gate down. I was going to tear down the whole damn system. I didn't think revenge would feel like this. I thought it would be louder, more cinematic, like a standing ovation or a slow clap at the end of a courtroom drama. But when the final ruling came in, When the last signature dried on the settlement papers and Karen's name was officially stripped from everything, it was quiet. No fireworks, no victory parade, just a long, deep exhale, and the heavy realization that the thing I'd been holding onto for months, anger, grief, drive, had finally landed somewhere. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free and tired, but mostly free. The HOA was dead, gone, legally dissolved, its assets seized. The next morning, the HOA's reign was officially over. The city took over the management of the community, appointing a rotating oversight committee and even setting up a hotline for emergencies. The gate was torn down, piece by piece, while the residents watched from their porches, sipping coffee, as if they were witnessing justice unfold right before their eyes. One neighbor even brought out lawn chairs. Another passed out cupcakes. It was the most cheerful demolition I'd ever seen. The keypad that had once denied paramedics entry now lay in a heap of broken circuits and bent metal. Someone spray-painted "Access Denied" on it before it was tossed into the back of a municipal truck. Karen was nowhere to be seen. She had moved out a week earlier, slinking away in the dead of night, clinging to whatever shred of dignity she had left. Her house had been sold a loss, her bank accounts drained by court-ordered damages. I later heard she ended up in a gated apartment complex in another part of the state. The irony would have been delicious if it wasn't so tragic, living in someone else's version of her old power. This time, she was just another resident. No clipboard, no control, just a gate that would deny her access, like poetic justice on a timer. I didn't follow up with her. I didn't need to. That chapter of my life was closed, and I had other things to focus on. Because here's the thing about going through hell and making out the other side. You start noticing who else is still stuck there. The stories didn't stop after the lawsuit. They kept coming: emails, letters, anonymous tips. Other neighborhoods, other HOAs, other Karens. Different names, same game. I wasn't surprised anymore. I was motivated. So I started something new. A foundation in my father's name. The Emergency Access Initiative. Our mission was simple: no more locked gates standing between first responders and the people who need them. We started small, with educational campaigns, community talks, interviews with local news outlets. Then, we moved into advocacy, working with state representatives to pass legislation that required emergency override systems in all gated communities. That one was personal. I stood in front of a committee and told them exactly what happened to my dad. Word for word. No sugarcoating, no dramatics. Just the brutal truth. He died because a keypad didn't recognize an ambulance. That was enough to push the bill through. And it wasn't just our state that paid attention. Other states began drafting their own versions. Momentum was a beautiful thing. I stayed in the house for a while after everything ended. Not because I loved it, but because it was his. My father had built that place himself, brick by brick, every corner filled with his stubborn pride. I couldn't bring myself to sell it yet. It was quiet now, without the threat of fines or HOA enforcers lurking with cameras and clipboards. The neighborhood changed too. People smiled more, talked more, laughed without checking over their shoulders. It was like a collective exhale had swept through the community. We were finally allowed to be neighbors again, instead of suspects in someone else's control fantasy. The front yard became a small memorial garden. Not flashy, just a bench, a plaque with my father's name, and a space for people to sit. Someone left flowers every week. I never found out who. Maybe one of the neighbors he used to help fix sprinklers for. Maybe just someone who remembered what happened. Either way, it reminded me that people don't forget, especially when something breaks the illusion of safety. That gate was supposed to keep danger out, but it had locked it in instead. And now, people were starting to ask the right questions. I didn't expect the second flash drive to haunt me like it did. I'd already won, hadn't I? Karen was gone. The HOA was dead. The laws were changing. But Linda had been right. What she gave me wasn't just extra evidence. It was a blueprint of a larger problem. Other HOAs Karen had consulted for. Other communities she'd influenced. Patterns of power abuse. Falsified records. One document listed a string of emergency reroutes that caused serious delays. One entry even ended in death. A child. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stop at just our neighborhood. So I didn't. I expanded the foundation's reach. I worked with journalists to expose systemic problems in private community management. I even started a podcast of all things, interviewing victims of HOA abuse. It gained traction faster than I expected. People needed a vent. They needed to know they weren't crazy, that the absurdity they were experiencing wasn't unique, that there were others fighting back. And slowly, like a crack spreading across glass, the image of the all-powerful HOA began to splinter. But even with all of that, some nights I'd still wake up and remember the sound of that keypad beeping, the cold metal of the intercom box, Karen's face on the camera screen, my voice cracking, my dad's voice in my head. Grief isn't something you erase with a court case or a settlement check. It lingers. It sharpens you. It sits quietly in your chest like a stone you just learn to carry. But the weight gets lighter when you know it wasn't for nothing. When you know that someone else's father might live because mine didn't. That a gate will swing open next time instead of holding firm. The last time I visited the old gate site, it was just open space. The posts were gone. The keypad hole filled in. Someone had planted flowers where the control box used to be. Bright, unapologetic marigolds. My dad hated flowers. He said they were just fancy weeds with an ego. But I think he'd have liked these, not for what they were, but for what they meant. That something once cold and indifferent had been replaced with something alive. As I stood there, hands in my pockets, a kid biked past me and waved. No gate to stop him. No clipboard to track him. Just a kid, free to come and go as he pleased. And that's when it really hit me. This wasn't just a story about revenge. It was about freedom, about refusing to let fear dress itself up as order, about tearing down the illusion of control when it becomes a cage, and about making sure no one ever dies behind a keypad again. I turned around and walked back to my car, the wind at my back, the sun breaking through the clouds. And just before I closed the door, I looked over my shoulder one last time and whispered, too quiet for anyone but me to hear, but loud enough for the memory to catch it. Too late for flowers, but at least nobody has to die to get in anymore. As I drove away from the old neighborhood, the weight of everything that had happened slowly began to settle in. The last chapter of this painful journey had ended, but the ripple effects would continue. There was something deeply satisfying about knowing that the gate, the one that had denied my father the help he needed, was gone. It had been dismantled piece by piece, just like the system of oppression that had allowed it to exist in the first place. The community was breathing again, free from the fear and control that had loomed over it for far too long. But there was more to the story than just the demolition of a gate or the closing of an HOA chapter. This was about more than revenge. It was about change. Real, tangible, long-lasting change. The community I had once fought for, the community that had watched me battle for my father's dignity, was finally free. It was no longer bound by the petty rules and the fear of retribution. In its place stood a neighborhood that felt alive, where neighbors could laugh, talk, and live without constantly looking over their shoulders. The oppressive weight of the HOA was gone, and with it, a sense of genuine freedom returned. And that was the part that stuck with me. The realization that what I had fought for wasn't just justice for my dad. It was freedom for everyone who had been trapped in that gilded cage of control. The foundation we created in my father's name, the Emergency Access Initiative, had grown far beyond what I ever imagined. We started small, but soon the idea caught fire. The more I spoke about my father's story, the more people started to speak out. It was as though, by sharing our experiences, we were breaking the silence that had allowed these abuses to fester. Victims of similar HOA power grabs reached out from all over the country, and slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. What had seemed like an insurmountable mountain of red tape and bureaucracy now felt like something we could chip away at piece by piece. The most rewarding part was seeing the laws change. It wasn't just about the HOA in my town. It was about every gated community, every neighborhood that had been at the mercy of an unchecked system. The legislation we fought for mandated emergency override systems in all gated communities. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about setting a new precedent, A precedent that said this would never happen again. A precedent that ensured no one else would die because a gate, a piece of metal and wire, stood in their way. More than legal victories or the foundation, it was the restored sense of community that mattered. I wasn't just fighting for change, but for connection, helping neighbors see each other as people, not rule breakers. I wanted to ensure the lessons we learned weren't lost. Safety should never come at the cost of humanity. My dad's death, though tragic, sparked something bigger. Standing at the old gate site, seeing marigolds in place of cold metal, I felt peace. My father's legacy became a movement for freedom, accountability, and justice, one that would continue until no one else faced the same injustice.